So artificial intelligence is the enormous opportunity for Australia and also the world. But as I said earlier, there is a rub to this, and that is Australia has to keep sweet for the president, well, certainly for the next 4 years. Trump's America First trade policy will include punitive tariffs against, it seems, Mexico, Canada, China and Europe. The aim is to get more things made in America and to export more goods to these countries. But the America First trade policy also has another nasty hook in it that could potentially affect Australia. In it, there's a reference to a retaliatory provision of US tax law that's never been used before. It gives the president the powers to hit extra taxes with any country that also, therefore, has American companies in it. Now, he doesn't have to go to Congress to do this. He can simply double the tax rate imposed on the US income of foreign companies and individuals whose laws are found to discriminate against US citizens or companies. Now, here in Australia, think the companies that operate in America, like BlueScope Steel, Amcor, Brickworks, Orica, Visy, Woodside, CSL, ResMed, Cochlear and James Hardie, and that's just for starters. They all have big and growing American operations. So watching the implications of that executive order this week is the Arnold Block Liebler tax partner, Sean Cartoon, who joins me now from Melbourne. Sean, always good to have a chat to you about these things. There's two ways, isn't it?
Hi, Ross, great to be on.
A lot of these companies have gone to America basically because they can see great opportunity. Lower taxes, cheaper energy prices, bigger markets. It makes sense for them to be there. They would be a little concerned if all of a sudden, as a result of the way in which we tax American companies here, they find their taxes there doubled by Donald Trump.
That's absolutely right, Ross. And look, this power that was included in an America First trade policy document that was released a couple of days ago, it's a power that is stated to be exercised by the president alone. And I understand it's never been exercised before, so it would be unprecedented in its use, but it would have Australian companies operating in the US worried, I would have thought.
OK, but then there's the other aspect of this, and that is more Australian companies you think are likely to head to America because of the growth in artificial intelligence there, because of the cheap energy, and because of what Donald Trump is promising is lower taxes.
That's right. I think that's right, Ross. The opportunities to do business in America for Australian companies and entrepreneurs for the next 4 years are simply huge, starting with reductions in regulations and with their tax settings. Just overnight, I heard Trump announced that he is looking to cut US taxes further, and it's mooted that he might reduce taxes to 15% in the US, which is half our corporate tax rate here in Australia. So it might well be that Australian businesses look to ramp up their operations in the US to take advantage of both the unprecedented low tax rates and also the very favourable business conditions over there.
All right, this is all about competition, quite clearly. We don't live alone in the world. And if the American tax rates and the American energy prices are much more competitive than what they are here in Australia, then Australian companies, particularly large companies that can be multinational companies like some of those I mentioned, they're completely nuts if they don't spend more of their shareholders' money in America and less of it here in Australia. It's not a good thing for Australia to have that capital leaving this country.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we have very sensible tax rules in Australia that say that if a corporate group is carrying on an active business in the US and generating US sourced income that's taxed in the US, then Australian corporate groups can generally bring that back to Australia without suffering top-up tax here in Australia. And that makes sense because our tax laws should not be a disincentive for Australian companies to grow and compete on the global stage.
OK, but then the sting in the tail, as I've said earlier, is what happens here with Australian policy. Now, if you consider two factors, one is the move which Donald Trump pulled out of this week to effectively have a universal minimum rate of tax for multinational companies, right? Now, that was actually partly engineered by Australia. We pushed that very aggressively to get the likes of the Googles and the Microsoft to pay a reasonable rate of tax here in Australia and not to transfer it overseas. The second one is that news bargaining code that I mentioned, and that quite clearly is directly aimed at those tech companies to pay local publishers and media companies, including News Corporation that we work for, to basically pay for their news. Now, Donald Trump might very well see that as being a genuine disincentive for those companies and therefore chase after Australia. You just don't know which way he'll go.
I think that's right, Ross. Both of those measures that you mentioned, the Pillar 2 reforms were enacted just in December last year, and the additional charge that was announced in conjunction with the media bargaining laws, that was also announced in December last year. So a lot remains to play out as to how and whether we actually proceed to implement those measures in light of how aggressive the Americans are coming out of the gates with the new Trump presidency.
Well, what's known is that, say, for example, Mark Zuckerberg at Meta, he's very much aware of the Australian situation. After all, it was Mark Zuckerberg who suddenly pulled out of that news bargaining code, which the government then decided to turn into a mandatory code to force them to pay. So there's no doubt if he's got the president's ear, the president's going to know all about Australia's behaviour in terms of that, but then no doubt also in regards to try and create this minimum rate of tax for multinational companies. So, there's no way known that it's going to escape Trump's attention.
Look, it'll need to be managed very, very carefully by the government, and I'm sure it will. But the bigger Trump vibe shift that I'm seeing is really a return to genuine competition between sovereign nations. And I think below the surface, as Australia, we really need to be thinking about how we are going to compete to increase our own productivity. And do we have the right policy and tax settings in place to achieve that? And if we don't, I think we will need to move really fast to ensure that we can continue to have the best companies and opportunities here in Australia, because one thing's for sure, we are in an intense competition now, and arguably we always have been. But I think we really need to focus on what we're doing over here in Australia from a productivity point of view, and I think that's the bigger issue that we need to be focusing on.
It'll be fascinating to see exactly whether the government is prepared to give up company tax revenue in particular, because remember, it cut the tax rates for small business, but politically didn't feel strong enough to be able to cut the tax rates for big business. So is that something they've got to look at as well?
Look, I hope so. Our corporate tax rate of 30% is up there in the world as one of the highest rates, but it's much more than just and complicated than just reducing a single rate. Really, everything should be on the table now. The Tax Institute released a great report a couple of years ago, The Case for Change, which is a holistic look at the Australian tax system. And sure, the corporate rate of tax should be in the mix. And I would argue it should come down, but that needs to happen in conjunction with a complete holistic root and branch look at our tax system, so that the government continues to be able to collect the taxes it needs to provide the services that we as Australians clearly also want. So there's a delicate balancing act there. But at the moment, I would argue that we are just adrift in the breeze, where there's a lot happening around us, and we need to take tax reform more seriously than ever.
Sean Cartoon, the Arnold Block Liebler tax partner, I appreciate your time on the program today.
Thanks, Ross.